So, hello and good day around the world. We are here today with session 10, dealing with the low band spectrum. And I would like to thank CITC and ITU for this great webinar that we have the last or these 3 days. And it's an honor for me to moderate this session. And we have an excellent list of panelists to discuss this topic today. And we have Gösta Karlner from the 450 megahertz Alliance. We have Svarka Magnuson from Ericsson. We have Andrew Kleck from Alphabet and JeanPierre Faison from Broadcast Network Europe. So thank you very much. And we will directly jump to the first presentation. Please don't forget to use the chat function. If you have any questions, we address them right after we had the presentation from all the panelists. And I hope and look forward that we have lively and interesting discussion on this topic. Thank you very much. And we start with Gösta Karlner. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Ove. And my name is Gösta Karlner, chairman of the 450 Alliance, an organization that primarily works with lower spectrums, coming out from the 450 megahertz from the beginning, and CDMA at the early days, and now LTE. We have expanded a little bit, and nowadays are working also, I would say, from most spectrums below 1 gigahertz all the way sometimes down to 100 megahertz. Working on use cases and the ecosystem, both from a supply agreement, from the supply side, and from technology side, and also regulatory side. And being quite active in this one, also with CITC and ITU in different forms. So with that, maybe jumping in a little bit, short introduction, taking to the first slides here, and describe a little bit our view on what we see in our community with regard to the lower spectrums. The lower spectrums, as we see it, have a number of different characteristics. It's pretty much the last or the longest reaching coverage to connect the unconnected. And it might be whatever spectrum it is, and it's quite often in this case used by operators, and often used in the traditional means of 3GPP spectrum for LTE and others. But also, I mean, we focus on our organization pretty much on 3GPP spectrum, as I said. So we also have, of course, broadcast, we have PMR. It's a lot of coexistence in this spectrum, which makes it a bit more interesting to work with. But we not only connect the unconnected, we see quite often now, especially on the spectrum where we have been focusing on the 400 megahertz areas, to where organizations build their own dedicated networks. It's not really the bandwidth that the traditional operators are super interested in having. So when you do a smaller niche bandwidth or smaller spectrum bandwidth, it can actually be affordable for somebody else to buy it as well and use just for their purpose. And it might be that that bandwidth is perfect for that requirement for a dedicated network. The dedicated networks also ties in a little bit to an overlay where you have maybe a network from a commercial operator, but you want to enhance security or availability or other things, where you actually do a very small overlay with the lower spectrums. And that's also what we see maybe, especially in the 400 megahertz band, but also now from 700 or from the 800 to 700 will be interesting to see how the 600 will be adapted. Of course, everybody has a different view on that. We mainly promoting whatever is achievable, but we should also say all these spectrums, I mean, they are fulfilling a very important function which is connectivity. I mean, the next step out from this, when you come to the lower spectrums, are quite often satellite. So as long as you're going terrestrial, the lower spectrum is a critical function for many communications solutions today. If we jump to the next slide. So what are the challenges here from our side? And I think a lot of what we work with here is to evolve the ecosystem around the lower spectrums to make sure that we utilize this spectrum, or we can utilize it as efficient as possible, to make sure that there are chipsets, base stations, handhelds, the full range of products to be able to do this, and to complement PMR, broadcast, and other services that also utilize the same spectrum. I think the essential here, and a lot of the work we put in, is to find a good coexistence both by the broadband services and other services in this band. When we're looking at 400 bands, the map on the side here shows a little bit on the reach where we have active operators today, or operations today, because not all of them are operators. We can also say there are quite a lot of operators here that are actually sitting on spectrum but not utilizing it, especially in these spectrums, which we find a bit unfortunate. We see the expansion of the spectrums now, as you say. Also, we expect it not only to start with the 600, it might also go further down to the 380. We have seen trials in the 200 bands as well with LTE, which is challenging, and especially coming into those spectrums which might already be utilized by others. So there are a lot of movements and discussions in this one, but I would say also the driving force here are maybe not so much the traditional operators. And if we jump to the next slide here, I would say we see a fairly scattered usage of spectrum in the really lower bands. If we go below 700, if you go from 700 now, it's really traditional operators to a large extent. Then you have your chunk of broadcast, and then you have a fairly wide range of different kind of operations in the 400 bands. Since we're focusing on that, I thought it could be interesting also for the involvement of the rest of the spectrum in the lower bands. We have everything from classic operators that operates this band. We have netcos for operators, where you have operators combining these four different things. And we have the verticals and private network operators that steps in. And we see a large push now from utilities and from public safety, transport, and so to step in to this field as well. And I think that's also maybe where we'll see an expansion, because the operator business model might not always fit these smaller chunks of lower spectrum. I think I will leave it there, because I hope we're going to have a lot of questions later on. So maybe we can move on to more presenters. So thank you very much for taking.
Okay, thank you, Gustav, for starting off the presentations here in the session. And our next speaker on the list is Svarka Magnuson. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Uwe, and thanks to ITU, CTC, for providing this opportunity to discuss this important matter of low band spectrum. And I'm representing Ericsson, so my focus will then obviously be on IMT aspect for these frequency bands. And if I may have my first picture on the screen. Thank you very much. So this is the then I would presume fairly well-known picture of the characteristics of IMT, different frequency bands, noting the need then to have spectrum in different frequency ranges. And in this era of 5G, there's a lot of talk about the very high bit rates and the extremely low latency that can be achieved mid-band and millimeter wave. However, as has already been noted by Gösta in the previous presentation, coverage is extremely important. We have to be inclusive regarding all the people living in rural areas, but not only rural areas. It's important to remember that these low frequencies also provide excellent coverage for even urban areas, for people who are inside by the deep indoor coverage. That's extremely important too. And noting further with the development of NR that we can, even in these low frequencies with not so extremely high bandwidths, we can provide good, very good latency and reliability for, let's say, verticals who have a need for extremely good coverage. All of these aspects are very important then for the for using the UHF spectrum for IMT. So let's go to the next page. Lots of information on this page. What I want to say is that there's a very large amount of work going on in 3GPP. You can see all the different frequency arrangements here, both for LTE and NR. They're obviously quite similar. In particular, I want to point out that for the future, we have the additional work that has the important work in the 600 megahertz frequency range, bands 71 and N71, that enables use of this frequency resource between 600 and 700 megahertz. Next page, please. On top of the work done in 3GPP to enable use of the important UHF spectrum, we have equipment, in this case, as you see on the screen, devices being made available for the spectrum. And below 1 gigahertz, we see already now 183 announced 5G devices and more than 14,000 LTE devices. In other words, we have a very, very complete ecosystem also for these more forward-looking bands, 600 megahertz bands, 71 and 71, where we have hundreds of devices already available. Not a surprise, perhaps, given that some countries, perhaps most notably North America, are moving forwards with the bands 71 and 71. Next page, please. And just to summarize then the regulatory situation as seen from the radio regulations after WRC 19. I'm fully aware that this does not give you the full picture of what the radio regulations say about the UHF bands above 470 megahertz. This is only intended to provide information about the mobile allocations and IMT identifications. And above 694, 698, depending on the region, there's a solid allocation, primary allocation to mobile and identification for IMT. Below that, regions 2 and 3, a number of countries indicated in brackets have moved forward with the footnote mobile primary allocation together with IMT identification. So this is reflecting what I already mentioned in the last picture, that in some cases, there's already a movement to use spectrum below 700 megahertz. Next picture, please. So, in order to summarize, low bands, very important for IMT. The 5G is very important, but it's not only about very high bit rates, low latency. Never forget coverage aspects. And I would say coverage in combination with the good MBB capacity for people living in the more rural areas and also indoor coverage in urban, suburban areas. The mobile community providing the work in 3GPP in terms of the frequency arrangements and equipment availability, as we've seen recently on the pictures. The ecosystems, they're obviously expanding constantly. And all in all, this provides a good spectrum opportunity for frequency bands in the UHF range. The possibility to expand for those countries, I should say, that need this. Obviously, there's going to be differences between different parts of the world and different countries. But for those who are in need of additional UHF spectrum, there are frequency arrangements, there is equipment. and equipment ecosystems are constantly expanding. Last but not least, spectra is an extremely valuable resource. UHF spectrum, perhaps in particular, is a limited resource. And we're doing what we can in the mobile community to provide opportunities for nationwide coverage, rural, indoor, and assuming then that there can be a provision of the right incentives for this type of investment, which we believe is absolutely crucial to obtain the good nationwide coverage. Thank you very much.
So, thank you, Svarka, for the insights from the IMT community, so to say. I would like to hand over to Andrew Kleck from Google for his presentation.
Okay, thank you, Uwe, and I'd like to express my appreciation to CITC and ITU for inviting us here to speak. It's been an interesting conference so far, very educational. So I'm going to just say a very few brief words about sort of the engineering side of low band versus the other bands to sort of set up what some of the opportunities and challenges are. So if you could go to my first slide, please. So it's become relatively fashionable in the last few years to refer to spectrum in terms of low band, mid band, and high band. The fact is there's really no official definition of what low band is, what mid band, what high band is. But in this session, we're talking about spectrum roughly between 400 megahertz and 1 gigahertz. And that, by anyone's definition, is squarely in the low band spectrum. So let me talk a little bit about the sort of the engineering differences between the different bands, because it's important to understand how that impacts the use of low band. So the low band spectrum is generally longer wavelength signals. So that's sort of a wonky thing to think about if you're not a physicist or something, but it has real world impact on how we use the band. For one thing, the longer wavelength requires bigger antennas to achieve the same gain. Just as an example, if you wanted to get the same gain of an antenna at 700 megahertz that you do at 3.5 gigahertz, the antenna would have to be about 5 times the size of the 3.5 gigahertz antenna in order to get the same gain at 700 megahertz. So it makes a big difference physically in the way that you use the band. The other thing is that the amount of interaction that the wave has with things like trees and buildings and things, stuff that we call clutter, also depends on the wavelength. The longer the wavelength, a little bit less interaction there is with those types of materials. So at 700 or in the low band below 1 gigahertz, we have a little bit less interaction with trees and buildings and things that we do. It impacts the propagation a little bit less than it does at mid band and high band. It's still, though, a very much an important factor. The low band spectrum is heavily congested for practical reasons and for other reasons, but we've evolved to higher and higher bands as time has gone on. So the lower bands are more evolved than the higher bands. A lot more use of the bands. Equipment is generally, amplifiers, things like that are generally cheaper to make at the lower bands, and so this has led to very heavy use of the low bands, in addition to the propagation considerations. But on the other hand, because there's less overall frequency space in the low bands, there's less allocation bandwidth available in the low band. So just as an example, in the low band below, if you define the low band as below 3.1 gigahertz, which is how some people define it, the biggest single chunk of spectrum is in the allocation table. It's only about 200 megahertz wide. If you look at just the band we're talking about today, 400 megahertz to a gigahertz, the largest allocation chunk in the allocation table in the ITU for region 2, for example, just about 100 megahertz, and that's the broadcast part of the band. So there's not, a whole lot of contiguous spectrum available at the low frequencies, and so that makes it even more challenging to find space to do the kinds of things. If you saw Svarka's chart of the LTE bands, there's lots of little bits and chunks below a gigahertz, but there's no 500 megahertz chunk of LTE spectrum or 5G NR spectrum. Just for comparison, midband, depend on who you talk to, but if you define it as 3.1 to 24 gigahertz. The wavelengths are smaller than they are at low band, and so there's a little more impact of clutter, trees and buildings on propagation. The antennas are smaller than low band. It's still congested. I mean, there's still a lot of use of the bands 3.1 to 24 gigahertz, but at the same time, you can find bigger contiguous chunks in the allocation table. In this range, you can find a chunk of spectrum depending on which region and things you're talking about, but up to about 2 gigahertz in size. So you have a relatively large chunk of spectrum that you can use in midband. And then finally, if you go to high band, which is sort of approaching the millimeter wave spectrum, so the frequencies above 24 gigahertz, the wavelength is shorter, can be much shorter. So antennas can be much smaller. But at the same time, your wave interacts a lot more with the space around you, a lot more with leaves and trees and the atmosphere, molecules in the atmosphere and things like that. So propagation gets much more impacted by the presence of clutter and atmosphere and things like that. So you have to start taking that into account, and the signal doesn't travel quite as far as effectively. It's less congested there, and there's some parts of the spectrum in upper millimeter wave band where there's in effect no congestion whatsoever. It's wide open, and there's bandwidth abundance there. That's why there's interest in 5G and millimeter wave spectrum. You can get tens of gigahertz of contiguous allocation blocks in the high band, so it's very appealing from that point of view. So that just gives you a little flavor for the difference in the different bands and especially in terms of what we deal with in low band. So the next slide, please. So regardless of the band you're using, propagation considerations matter. And in fact, the discussion today is incumbents and new technology, and that really is going to require shared spectrum. We've done a lot of propagation measurements, and we see that the models typically under-predict propagation loss, and real propagation loss is actually much larger than what's predicted in a lot of the models, and that's lost opportunity. So our point is propagation matters. And then finally, the last slide here, very quickly, the reason the models don't do a very good job. This is one example. On the left is a Google Earth reconstructed image of Manhattan. As you see, there's a lot of buildings and trees and clutter and things like that there when you look at it in 3D. But some of the principal models that are used in the band, for example, Longley Rice or other models, they don't take that clutter into account. So on the right, if you flatten all those buildings, that's what the propagation models think that Manhattan looks like. They don't take into account all the blockage caused by the buildings. So our point all along is that if you're going to share spectrum, you really need to have a very valid propagation and clutter model on which to base your sharing opportunities, even in the low band, because even in a low band, clutter models or clutter and propagation models matter. So that's it. Interesting aspect of today's panel, and I'm looking forward to the discussion and the questions later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And I would like to come to our last speaker in the panel today. It's JeanPierre Faison from Broadcast Networks Europe. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Uwe. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, CITC of Saudi Arabia and the ITU for the kind invitation for this fantastic conference. The topic today is the 400 megahertz, 1 gigahertz band. And I think it is very, very interesting because the frequency range has seen a lot of changes in the allocation. Used to be predominantly allocated to broadcasting, and now, through the years, it is predominantly allocated to mobile services. So the public policy issues associated to it have also changed a lot. It changed from reallocating spectrum from one sector to another, to allowing various important sectors to coexist and to develop harmoniously. I represent one of those sectors, the terrestrial broadcasting sector. I represent Broadcast Networks Europe, which is the trade association for broadcast network operators. And I will address 3 points. The first one is that digital terrestrial television is a worldwide success. The second one is that this dynamic is continuing and growing. And the third one is how we are using the remaining of the spectrum, that is the 470, 694, or 698 megahertz, depending on the region, spectrum for television broadcasting. Let's move on to the next slide. My first point, digital terrestrial television is a worldwide success. In this chart, you see in blue the countries which have actually launched digital terrestrial television. That represents 155 countries, 91% of the world population. And the other ones are, most of them, with analog television. Typical coverage of digital terrestrial television is about 70 to 98% of the population. And there is very strong penetration. It varies depending on the countries, but on average, it's more than 40% of the television households which receive digital terrestrial television. And will not only receive, but use it. And in some countries, it goes much over 60%. So this is a worldwide phenomenon. This is a picture. How is it evolving? That will be the next slide. Next slide, please. Yes, thank you. And on this chart, you see the cumulative population of the countries which have launched DTT. So we see that the population is constantly increasing, nearly 7 billion. And also, you see year by year how many countries, new countries, are actually launching digital terrestrial television. Well, you can see, for instance, that since 2016, that is in the 5 last years, 31 new countries have launched DTT. Which means when you launch, it usually takes about 5 years, sometimes 10 years to roll out a full network, and you expect probably 10 to 15 years of usage to recoup your investment. So this is long-term investment. And why do they invest now in digital terrestrial television? Because it is affordable, because it is sustainable, and it provides a very high-quality public service, which is very popular. It also facilitates the analog switch off. Finally, the usages associated to terrestrial broadcasting, that is linear television, it remains an essential usage. Of course, there are new ways to consume video and consume contents, but linear television remains very strong, depends on each country. But for instance, in Europe, on average, it's 3 hours and 30 minutes of daily viewing of television, and 90% of that is live. Especially in times of crisis, COVID-19, we see that people gather around the television, either for information and also for entertainment and recomfort. So television is growing, digital terrestrial television is growing, and its usage associated to a usage which is very resilient. Let's see how it uses spectrum now. That will be the next slide, please. There has been very strong investment in broadcasting to clear the 800, then the 700 megahertz band. As a result, now the largest part of the low spectrum band, if we define it as it is as 400 to 1 gigahertz, is now for mobile services. They have 700, 800, and 900 megahertz band. So probably for IMT 2020, this is in those bands that the most efficient way to use has to be looked for. And for instance, in Europe, the 700 megahertz band is one of the pioneer bands for 5G. The remaining band, the 470, 694, 698, according to regions, is efficiently shared by digital terrestrial television with other sectors like PMSC, that is microphone and live spectacles, other TV white space services, and radio astronomy. So the spectrum is very much used. And then, of course, there are some countries which have less use for the digital terrestrial television spectrum, but there are ways to address those, and to use the spectrum efficiently. And actually some flexibility is possible and is foreseen in different countries, for instance, in the European UHF decision. The last point, I think it's within the spectrum that terrestrial broadcasting will continue to innovate, because it has to remain an attractive platform. So be able to deliver the most recent audiovisual formats, also be able to deliver interactivity, either through broadcasting mode, but also through hybrid cooperation with broadband networks, and also able to reach new categories of devices such as smartphones, tablets, and cars. And for that, we're exploring the potentialities of such technologies such as 5G broadcast, which is a specific set of technologies taken out of 5G. And there has been some, my colleague from EBU yesterday, Walid Sami, detailed that in very interesting views. In conclusion, and that will be my last slide. Next slide, yes, thank you. In conclusion, we see terrestrial television broadcasting as here to stay. But for that, 476.94 MHz is the only remaining spectrum for modern DTT. It's no longer an issue of trying to find new ways to improve the use of the spectrum. It is the way we have to keep this spectrum so that an important sector can continue to develop, because this brings business, social, cultural, and sovereignty benefits. The key, as has been said by Uwe, there is discussion at the WRC 23. The key on that is regulatory stability for 476.94 MHz band, therefore providing long-term certainty to the countries which are ongoing and planning investment in that area. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Jean-Pierre, for your presentation. And now we would open the floor for a discussion. And as when we are discussing these low bands, I mean, it's pretty clear there's no more spectrum available. And here for this session, we defined the low bands between 400 megahertz and 1 gigahertz. So a pretty limited amount of spectrum, which will definitely not grow, very clear. So one question that puzzles me is, how can we find the right balance between the services, and how can we address the need of the stakeholders adequately? And I would like to give this question to the different stakeholders, starting with Gösta from 450 megahertz Alliance for the PPDR, I believe, right?
I think for us it's a big variation on how you use this. I mean, I think I took a little bit of a point on that in the beginning. That I mean, when we look at usage of this, if we're going in where I built networks in the 400 megahertz areas in Indonesia, this has pretty much been for rural broadband, for schools, for these kind of services. If we're looking at it for a place like Luxembourg, it will of course be very different. You will probably use it for PDDR, for other kind of more critical services. So I think the flexibility, and that's also a little bit how it is with a lower spectrum. It has to be adjusted for the country and the environment and the conditions you step into. I think that's extremely important that you utilize them in a good way. There are countries that, are areas of the countries as well, when you're looking at Argentina, Brazil, that probably will use it more for broadband and critical communications in parallel. But you still need that dual service, I think, in these, especially when you're looking at it from what I do more on an LT perspective. And I think you cannot replace everything just saying this is the only way, this is the only stakeholder, to say that is only the operators kind of product line that needs to be done for these kind of spectrums will also be very hard, because they are not maybe supplying these services where you convert services from traditional analog services or from whatever it might be, non-existing services, to something real for these countries. I think you need to work in a wider forum with other types of parties to be the carrier of the service as well. maybe
Okay,
a little bit.
Okay, thank you very much. So let's hand over this question to Svarka. I mean, IMT community is always very active pushing for new spectrum. So how can we find the right balance between the different services?
Yes, thanks, Uwe. We should not pretend that this is an easy question. I mean, that's, I presume, why you're asking it. Otherwise, there would be no point. So, given that this is a very complex matter, and also the fact that it's no secret that spectrum reallocations or modifications in the regulations, it takes time. As Jean-Pierre mentioned, there are huge investments into various kinds of technologies. There has got to be some kind of certainty for people to do those investments, whether it's broadcasting or IMT. So I think that what we really need here is forward-looking work. Keep options open without causing unnecessary uncertainty. We have work in ITU, we have work starting up, I think, again within CPT to give proper consideration to future opportunities. And it's extremely important that we have input both from the different types of industry, whether it's broadcasting or IMT industry, and also from the administrations, because in the end, what we want is to have spectrum allocated in such a way that it gives the maximum benefit to the country in question that has the rights to use it. And that will vary from one country to another, depending on their needs for whatever technology and service that different industries can provide. So I think there's no easy way. We have to work hard. We have to cooperate, as Gösta mentioned. We have to be very forward-looking. And yes, we're always hungry in the IMT industry, as you mentioned, but we should be somewhat reasonable as well. So hard work, forward-looking in various fora. I think that is the way forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Svarka. Jean-Pierre, anything to add here from your side?
Perhaps we could mention that we've worked a lot on to try to use spectrum more and more the most efficient way. For instance, introducing new coding and new coding both on the signal coding, but also on the image coding. And this has resulted in nearly optimal, I think, or probably optimal transmission systems which are being deployed. And this requires extensive work in preparation, in investment, but also investment from the public and from the broadcasters to provide the right transmission chain. So I think each sector is doing efforts so that spectrum can be used more efficiently, which actually produces more spectrum for everyone. This is what we have done. And I think we have now reached, I think, a limit. So it's probably more a matter of using the spectrum we have the most efficiently to provide innovation also.
Okay, thank you very much. So let us come to a next question. And I did like very much this one slide from Andrew where we had the different frequencies, low, mid, high band, which pretty much matches the theme that we have with the next sessions here in the webinar. But and my question is, can low bands be complemented by spectrum and other frequencies, and how would that be done best? So this would be a question for Andrew.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think one place where low band can be particularly useful is basically an anchor band. So you do your control signaling on a low band channel, which has better penetration into buildings and around trees and things like that. And you do your service link, your data link on higher frequency, mid band or high band channels. That way you're maintaining control and connection to your devices using a band that is particularly reliable propagation wise, but then providing the kind of data throughput that you can only get at the higher bands where you have larger chunks of spectrum. So I see all of these hooks built into, for example, 5G NR are sort of ideal for using this scheme of anchoring in low band channels and then moving your data connection off to high band channels.
Thank you very much. And
I can maybe add to that, since we operate quite a lot of these low bands in our community. And I mean, for 450, that's in the 400 bands where it is very scarce resources of bandwidth. We usually do at least quad band, even if it's a dedicated network from somebody, to actually be able to facilitate higher speeds, or, you know, if it's a utility, to actually facilitate connectivity in a power plant, even though the smart grid might be good enough on the 400 or just a 3 to 5 megahertz bandwidth. You know, need significantly more if you're going to control the complete power plant and connect that one.
Okay, great. Yeah, Svarka, also to you.
Yes, thank you.
Carrier aggregation the answer to that?
There was a very good, interesting point made by Andrew there. But I think that whereas we should, of course, make every effort to utilize the other frequency ranges, such as mid-band, and perhaps primarily around 3 gigahertz, as efficiently as possible, also in terms of coverage, we will not be able to escape the fact that some traffic will need to be using the UHF spectrum as well. And it takes us back to the fact that we benefit in many industries, but also in the mobile communication industry, for having UHF spectrum in order also to meet traffic requirements. That's not going to go away. Thank you.
Okay, great. So there's still a high need then for the band in the UHF. So then my question is, we are talking a lot about also technologies which enable a higher efficiency. What kind of technologies would you see could be especially beneficial for the low band? And I would like to start with Andrew on that.
Yeah, I think, you know, whenever we talk about efficiency in mid-band or high band, everyone always thinks about, you know, multi-user MIMO and beamforming antennas and things like that. Direct the energy where it's needed and avoid directing it where it's not needed. I think that still has application in low band, but of course, at this point, your antennas become enormous if you want to have, you know, good directionality. And then that becomes a political challenge because of the siting issue. Nobody wants you know, a 10-foot tall antenna mounted on a light pole outside their apartment window or something like that. So that gets to be a challenge. And not to say that there aren't, you know, applications for it if you're operating on a tower or something, you know, a commercial wireless site with lots of space and availability. I still think multi-user MIMO and beamforming and things are probably one of the most efficient technologies to improve spectrum efficiency. But as mentioned earlier, I think work on improving coding and robustness and things is probably the single most biggest improvement we can make at low band at this time, absent, you know, deploying giant antennas for beamforming and things. So anyway, that's sort of my. I think the increase in coding technology is probably the key here.
Okay, I think JeanPierre, you were already touching that a little bit. Do you share this view?
Yes, absolutely. Well, we have introduced, I think we've reached with the DVB-T2 technology, I think we've reached the threshold in terms of transmission coding. I think nothing more efficient has been done, and we don't see, even with 5G broadcast, 5G broadcast can help us for small smartphones and mobile reaching. But for the distribution to rooftops, I think it's DVB-T2 is the optimum. There is progress in the signal coding. For instance, HEVC, which is being introduced, is a huge progress. But at the same time, we need to code higher definition formats. For instance, high definition television and 4K now are becoming more and more common. So this compensates that.
Okay, thank you. And to Svarka, IMT, GGPP, very innovative guys. So what can they offer?
Yes, we sometimes lack that recognition, I think, about the innovations carried out in 3GPP. I was talking about innovation in other areas, but I think we have very innovative people in 3GPP. And I agree with what's been said by JeanPierre and Andrew. We have to just make sure that we use the radio channel as efficiently as we possibly can. And I think that we are all working on that very hard. I just wanted to mention a few things that I actually forgot in my presentation, and that is that in 3GPP, for both LTE and NR, there are constantly improvements being made regarding multicast and broadcast. I mean, that is one way to improve efficiency in what we're transmitting. Regarding the antennas, Andrew brought up, that's very interesting. I mean, we have now, let's say for IMT networks, we don't go as far down with our active antenna systems as UHF spectrum, but let's not rule that out for the future. Who knows? We may be able to either get acceptance for these enormous antennas, at least in some places, not necessarily in the urban areas, who knows? But also, who knows what theoretical advances we can make in the future. So we should not rule out more efficient antennas rather than those sector antennas that we use today for the future. So the quest continues. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So we got a very good list of questions from the audience. So I would like to jump that we take those now, also to address these questions that we got here. So the first one, again for Svarka, how we can solve the challenge between the coverage and quality of service in the low band system?
First response, thank you for that question. It's a difficult one. Coverage and quality of service. The first one is some kinds of quality of service, as I mentioned, I think, in my presentation, regarding the fairly low latency and reliability. That can also be achieved, and that has been then implemented for NR, at least for these bands. Obviously, we're not going to have the same latency and high bit rates that we do for mid-band and the millimeter wave. I mean, that's apparently, we cannot find 1 gigahertz of spectrum dedicated to IMT in UHF spectrum below 1 gigahertz. That's not going to happen. But still, I think that given the improvements in efficiency and the fact that we actually have, I would say, multiples of 10 megahertz, I think is about the right amount of spectrum we can achieve. We do deliver, I would say, good services for mobile broadband also in the UHF range. And as has been mentioned, we are always interested in additional spectrum within reasonable limits that can be used for improving the situation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Svarka. It's quite an interesting question, and I also want to give this question to Gustav.
Yeah, maybe put it a little bit. I think the quality of these lower spectrum is really that you actually know what they're going to be used for. It's important to build them for specific or for the correct use cases with the correct devices that you have planned to use for this use case, because the propagation model is like that. If you plan to do it with big devices, big antennas, from the end user side, it's going to be a different network than if you're going to do it for smartphones or for smaller devices or built-in sensors and so on. I think that's extremely important, because otherwise you raise noise floors and actually make not the best use of these bands. And I think that's quite important to have that when you're talking quality of service and efficient use of the spectrum. These are probably the most important things in the lower bands.
Okay, thank you. Okay, next question, and this definitely goes to Jean-Pierre. Does DTT need over 200 megahertz of bandwidth?
Okay, that's a very direct question, and my answer will be direct also. Answer is yes. And it's not only my answer. There's been, as you said, there is an agenda item at WRC 23, and there's a questionnaire for Region 1 countries asking them what they anticipate as needed for spectrum. And the overwhelming majority of the countries, so it's not only broadcast network operators, but the countries themselves, they anticipate that, yes, they need this 224 megahertz of spectrum for digital terrestrial television. So the answer is definitely yes. And I think I understand in the question there were some hints that perhaps we could serve a reduced set of channels with less spectrum somehow. But this is not a service that people want. Actually, people just don't want to have digital terrestrial television to receive a few channels. That doesn't work. And this has been tried in some countries. It does not work. What people want is an attractive bouquet, which is modern, which provides them the modern experience of television, not which provides them what they had 30 years ago, black and white.
Okay, thank you very much. And yes, Svarka, from your end, of course, what is your view on that?
I will just phrase it as a question instead to Jean-Pierre. But isn't it the case that you mentioned that most countries have answered that they need these 200 megahertz? Okay, but isn't it the case that there are still a number of countries that have reduced or even stopped using this kind of terrestrial broadcast for the distribution of TV? I mean, that things are happening at least in some countries. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think if we can debate that now endlessly, and of course there will be a lot of room, especially in ITU and the different groups of the ITUR and study group T or task group 6.1, where we have all this come together. And that was my initial question about the needs of the spectrum and how we can address it. I think that will be one part of the work that we all have to face in the couple of months and years to come. Let me switch to another question for Andy. What is your view on using advanced algorithms for improving propagation model?
Yeah, that's a great question. We're actually doing that. What you realize quickly is that we've used our vast resources of geodatabase, everything we know about buildings and building polygons and foliage polygons and everything that's built into Google Earth and Street View and all this information we have about building and clutter to develop ray tracing models and all sorts of things to improve propagation prediction in urban and suburban areas. And we've seen really good improvement in the accuracy of the models. So some of our state-of-the-art propagation models, taking all of our clutter data into account, are very, very accurate, or getting increasingly accurate. But there is a limit. I mean, propagation really is governed by the nature of your environment at a variety of scales, from very small to very large. And so it's hard to create a propagation model, an empirical propagation model written in closed form formulas that say the propagation loss from point A to point B is going to be this amount. There's just too many variables. It's not exactly chaotic, but it's kind of that thing where there's a lot of parameters that impact propagation. So one of the things that we've been experimenting with lately is the application of machine learning to propagation analysis. So you put in lots and lots of measurements, constant measurements, into a machine learning platform like our TensorFlow or other platforms. And just let it go through the machine learning process, and the application of machine learning combined with a large database of measurements provided by, for example, mobile phones as they're moving around in the environment or whatever, shows very, very good promise for improving propagation prediction in specific areas. So we really see it as sort of moving away from and I hate to, as a physicist myself, I hate to say moving away from physics-based models, but moving towards machine learning models to improve propagation prediction. So we sort of see that as the future. It's not quite there yet, but we see that as the future.
Okay, thank you very much. Svarka, for you, also something?
Thank you. I'm taking up a lot of airtime, but this was very interesting, so I have to ask some questions. We obviously have some propagation experts within Ericsson. I'm not one of them, unfortunately, but they still made me very interested. From Google, you make maps available, obviously, to the public. Do you have a similar availability of your propagation work, propagation models or propagation results, etc., that you just mentioned? It seemed very interesting. It might be of great interest to lots of people in the
Sure. So we do have product availability now where we take into account our geodatabase of clutter and our ray tracing models and things. We have network planning software that we offer that takes into account all of those geodata. So that product is available now. And we've been, our first application of that has been to network planning in the CBRS band and others because we're heavily involved in CBRS. But that product is available now. The machine learning is not available yet. We are, I should say, the humans are still learning about the machine learning aspect of propagation. So that's not quite available yet, but we're hoping that before too long we'll have some kind of developments there.
Wow, that was interesting, and maybe also a way how we can optimize this spectrum in the future and the usage of the spectrum in the future even more. Very good. Thank you very much. So next question, and this is again for Jean-Pierre. We see that you are using same technology as MNOs. Is it possible to join efforts and cooperate to deliver DTT?
Interesting question. Actually, right now we are not using the same technologies. We're using for instance, DVB-T, DVB-T2 technologies, and we are considering using evolutions of 5G technologies for what we call 5G broadcast, which would be a complement to digital terrestrial television aimed at reaching mobile devices. So perhaps, yes, in some future, there might be some complementarity. The only thing is that the business model may be very different in reality. Broadcasting model is very much based on free-to-air, at least as a basis, and then there is some pay TV, but it's usually on top of that. Depends, of course, of the countries, but that's mostly what is going on, for instance, in Europe. Whereas MNOs, well, they are trying to get subscription, basically, for their services. And this is a major difference in practice. They don't like to build networks so that they have no subscribers.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not so sure. What we're looking at is the cooperation, for instance, between the infrastructure we have, high power, high tower, basically systems, and whether it can be complemented in some cases.
Okay, thank you very much. That's also an interesting approach. I have a next question. It's very detailed for Gösta. What is the most common 450 megahertz bandwidth when you're using LTE?
Oh, well, I can be very specific. The actual band is band 31 is probably going to be surpassed by band 72, and the bandwidth is 5+5 or 3+3 megahertz.
Do you combine that already in areas?
Yeah, I would say, but not with carrier aggregation. It's more combined as just being two different carriers in parallel.
Okay, thank you very much.
Simple and deep. I like these questions. It's
well, if people have a chance to ask the expert, why not, right?
Yeah.
So, Svarka, you have also?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on. No, it was actually for the question that was directed at Jean-Pierre and the potential cooperation between broadcasting and the mobile communities. And I think that there's one aspect that was perhaps not intended in the question, but I think is very important, and that is the possibility to have flexible distribution of content. Broadcasting content, I mean, there are different types of broadcasting, but provision of content, that is certainly highly relevant for the mobile community to ensure that this can be distributed via the mobile equipment, the devices. I think that's also something that Jean-Pierre mentioned, the possibility for in the future have a more flexible distribution via the broadcasting network or the mobile network. that would be beneficial to customers. Everyone these days, almost everyone has a mobile phone, so that's a very, very big group of customers that could be addressed for the broadcasting content. Thank you.
So the interesting point would then be for you the combination of the linear portion plus the on-demand one, right?
That could be interesting, yes. I mean, I think that Jean-Pierre also mentioned that there's work to be done, but it certainly can be kept in mind for the future and for additional investigations. Thank you.
Okay, Andrew.
Yeah, just real quick, and question for Jean-Pierre. I know TV white space has been a concept for sharing broadcast spectrum and things like that. What's your view on improving opportunities for shared spectrum with broadcast spectrum going forward, whether it's in the TV white space model or something more sophisticated than that? Do you see opportunities for increased sharing?
Well, we're actually a very good experience, for instance, sharing the spectrum with PMAC does work very much. It's very efficient, and I think it's a very useful usage. TV white spaces, there is not so much experience in Europe, but I know it is developing in other countries, and I think that's also perhaps a very efficient way to do things, and to take into account that not all spectrum is used at every point of the territory. So I think that's good potential. I think the important thing for broadcasting is that the broadcasting service has to be must not be impaired by the sharing, and I think that's the case in every sharing system. So I know that the CBRS, for instance, is looking at ways to protect the incumbents while allowing new people to use the spectrum. I think that may be an interesting way to go.
Okay, thank you very much. So time flies. We are already past or just over. And however, I would like to take the opportunity to give the room for a last statement on the low spectrum bands. And I would like to start with Gösta Karlner.
Yeah.
So please go ahead.
I mean, maybe one of the things that we haven't not touched too much about, but which I think is extremely important in this one is the technical neutrality in the bands. I think also for evolving the future, if we're looking now 5 years ahead, from the experience on these bands, there are a lot of evolvements. There are a lot of technology evolvements, and it's important that we can adapt for everybody's sake, really, to utilize these spectrum in a most efficient way. And I know challenges we have had just in the 400 bands where they have been allocated for CDMA at one time, and we couldn't convert, we're not allowed to convert them to LTE and so on. I think it will probably be, the more you get neutrality and flexibility, you more encourage people to be creative in this space. And I think that's something I would really encourage in the lower bands going forward.
Thank you very much. Svarka, your take
on
the low bands.
Thank you. And I will comment upon something that I haven't mentioned before, which was recently raised here, is the white space use possibly of broadcasting spectrum. And I would like to urge some caution in that respect. We all want to use spectrum efficiently, but we have to keep long-term aspects in mind here as well. And actually, this kind of spectrum that we are talking about is absolutely perfect for wide area coverage, nationwide deployment, and we have to be careful so as not to, for short-term reasons, block that kind of usage. That would be disastrous in my point of view. Thank you.
Thank you, Svarka. So, Andrew, what is your final view on that for today?
For today. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. We hear mostly about mid-band spectrum these days. But the reality is probably the biggest challenge and the biggest conundrum is the low band spectrum, because it's the most evolved, it's the most in demand, yet at the same time, because of its physical characteristics, it's probably the most difficult to share. So you think from a technical perspective, perhaps a lot of our technical development should be less focused on mid band and high band, where the spectrum use is a little easier to work out. and more focused on the low band where the demand is, but the sharing, situation is a little more challenging. So I don't know. I think the low band is especially below, when I saw this panel was focused below a gigahertz, that's a really low band. Maybe there should be a lot of technical development, technical focus on how we make sharing possible in these lower band spectrum.
Okay, great. Thank you, Andrew. And Jean-Pierre, your final words.
Thank you. Well, two remarks. First, I think we learned from Andrew that low band starts at 3 gigahertz. So I think perhaps it would help also to focus part of the debate on between 1 gigahertz and 3 gigahertz. Perhaps there are ways to find spectrum that would make everyone happy. So, and actually there is a lot of spectrum which has been identified for IMT 2020 in those bands, I think. So perhaps it could be used. The other thing I would like to point out is that this low band spectrum that we have been discussing today is vital for digital terrestrial television. So it's really a matter of keeping that industry and that sector alive, and we need it, absolutely. So really the issue is coexistence between sectors. It's not reallocation.
Okay, thank you very much. So from my side, it was an extremely interesting panel and a very lively discussion. It was great to have you all here, and I would like to give and hand back for the next sessions.
Thank you, Uwe, and I will concur with that. That was a really interesting panel. So thank you, Uwe. Thank you as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Uwe. Thanks, everyone.
And Jean-Pierre. So fascinating discussion looking at those low bands, and we're going to be moving on later in the day to have separate panels that are going to be focusing in a similar way on the mid-band and the high bands as well. So please do stay with us for that. But before then, we're delighted to be able to bring you another thinking point. So for those of you who've been here for the last couple of days, you might have caught the 2 thinking points we've had so far, bringing together influential academic representatives to talk about maybe a few new ideas that are slightly outside some of the issues that are being covered directly in the session. So meant to be a presentation that stimulates thought and discussion. And we're delighted now to welcome our speaker for the thinking point today, Bill Lair. So Bill, welcome. So Bill is a research associate at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and is going to be giving us a presentation on secondary spectrum markets for a shared future. So looking at how the emergence of secondary spectrum sharing markets will impact wireless industry economics. So Bill, really looking forward to that, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. So it's a real pleasure for me to be here today, and I'd like to thank the organizers of this, Drs. Al Tamini and Al Tabi, the CITC Saudi Arabia, and the ITU for putting together what I think is a really excellent conference. And Dan, thank you for the introduction. I'm at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Lab, which I'm sure the audience knows is almost completely staffed with computer scientists and network engineers and electrical engineers. I'm an economist, and so this will be a little bit different bit of thinking. So what I'm going to be talking about today is the economic policy research agenda and some of the thoughts of the role that secondary markets in spectrum can play in enabling a shared spectrum future. And the high level point is, unless we actually figure out how to get secondary markets to work, we're not going to be able to realize spectrum efficiency in the long term. But understanding what that means is sort of part of what I'm going to try and do in this talk. So could you jump ahead to slide number 3? So before I do, I just want to lay down some slide 3. That's one too many, right? Thank you. So first, just some starting assumptions that I'm just assuming everybody more or less agrees with. The first is that everybody wants more spectrum. This is not an issue or a space where we're taking spectrum away from folks who have no use for it and don't need it, and that's forever going to be the case. So it's not like the government has too much spectrum and it needs to go to commercial uses, and the government's never going to need that spectrum. That's just not true. Everybody needs and wants more spectrum. We need it for communications, we need it for sensing, active and passive, all different types of technologies, and for all different kinds of business models, whether you're mobile network operators or your equipment types of providers. Everybody wants more spectrum. It's also the case that spectrum is becoming in an economic sense, more commodity-like, as in it's easier for people to move functionality that uses a spectrum to different frequency bands than it used to be in the past. But it is never going to be a commodity in the sense like a pork bellies are or toilet paper is. The third thing is the future is really going to need shared spectrum. And there are many, many ways to share. And so, for example, roaming, exclusive licenses, unlicensed, the CBRS band, all of these are different ways to share the spectrum. All of those are models at work. All of those, in an abstract sense, could be thought about as models for secondary market stuff. So exclusive licensees that retain the ownership of their spectrum, but lease it out or potentially on a real market basis, one could view that as a form of a secondary market. Roaming arrangements between mobile carriers are another form. It's a way in which the spectrum resources bundled with the whole service are transferred over time. The third is when we think about markets and we think about what's getting traded, we can think about it in terms of the real asset, so the rights to use the spectrum. The usage of the spectrum is inherently local. It's local in frequency space, it's local in geographic space, it's local in time, etc. And it's real time. So spectrum is a renewable resource. If there was capacity in the spectrum a second ago and no one used it, that's lost. But if it was used a second ago but is not being used now, it's available again. So in that sense, it's renewable. That's different from if you eat a piece of fruit, you've eaten that piece of fruit's gone. Now, the management and everything else, the planning and everything else, all that decision making about how spectrum is actually used, that doesn't need to be either local or real time. And in most business situations, it's not. So the management decisions, the business strategy, for example, investment planning, all of that takes place over many different time scales and in many different ways. The fifth point I want to make is that if spectrum is really abundant, then the issue here that the markets might solve is to help us coordinate coexistence. It's not about trying to figure out which is the resource that should get the spectrum. Everybody that wants the spectrum should get it if it's sufficiently abundant. If it's scarce, on the other hand, the markets can play a role in allocative efficiency, which is directing the spectrum to the highest value uses. And the third point is that the future is fundamentally uncertain, so risk management is an important issue. Let's go to the next slide. Next slide, thanks. So, what is ultimate goal of secondary markets and spectrum? Well, it's not so that we can have fun trading spectrum. It's basically so that we can eliminate spectrum access bottlenecks that are viewed as holding up the efficient and useful uses that the spectrum would otherwise be put to, which is, growth in wireless services and innovation. Okay, so that's what we're trying to do. So we're trying to basically figure out at the long time cycle how we can move spectrum from uses and technologies that are not making the best use of that spectrum to open up that access to that spectrum to new uses and technologies that are more efficient, better able to use it, and will create more value. So what does a secondary market do? Well, it allows us to transfer or potentially modify either the usage rights or the derivatives. The usage rights are what we're initially focusing on. And if you think about what are those usage rights, well, there's some sort of thing. Imagine what that widget is in the electro space. And so Robert Matheson wrote a paper back in 2006, and there's another version of that by Robert Matheson and Adele Morris in 2012 that talks about the fact that, interference occurs at the receiver, and that if you differentiate the way the signals arrive at a receiver in terms of frequency, time, spatial location or angle of arrival, in any of those ways, if you had a perfect receiver, you'd be able to disambiguate those signals, and those signals could coexist in that same spectrum. Okay, so generally, there's some notion that's set by the current set of technology, the regulatory rules and whatever, about how commodityable the spectrum is and how much you could maybe define up in little blocks and then trade it like cubes of sugar or rolls of toilet paper or whatever. Now, to actually do that or realize that, it's sort of better as a thought experiment than it is in reality. So almost assuredly, what you're actually going to be trading are some sort of derivative securities, which are tied to the underlying assets usage rights. And so it's going to be some sort of virtualized model of that. But also, when you think about derivative securities, financial markets, you're talking about a lot of other stuff like futures contracts, forwards, et cetera. And all of those things are also incredibly important. And they're useful things like risk management for managing the unavoidable uncertainty that we confront. So what do market transactions do in a secondary market? Well, you realize gains from trade, so that when you transfer a resource from a high value use to a low value use, there's gains from trade there. You're also matching buyers and sellers, because if you can't do that, then you don't know how to realize those gains from trade. Now, if the market's efficient, those trades are generally happening at the opportunity cost of the spectrum. And so another value that markets can do is the prices that come out of those markets are a summary statistic for the resource's value that anybody that has any dependency on spectrum potentially can use for risk management. So if you're talking about, is spectrum scarce or not, if it is, and we think there's real demand that's greater than supply in whatever band or wherever it is, call that real spectrum scarcity. And then the markets play a very important role in allocative efficiency, the ability to transfer the spectrum from a low value use to a high value use. And if the distance over which they're transferring that is large, then there's a lot of gain to be had there. The artificial scarcity is in the sense that if there's white space, even if their gains from trade aren't particularly large, but there's opportunities for additional value to be shared, then you're talking about coordinating coexistence. Can you go to the next slide? So this slide's basically, where do we think spectrum scarcity is going, and what does that mean for the prices or value of spectrum in a world where secondary markets work efficiently? That's really the question I'm asking here. So it's a thought experiment as to, if you thought about like plotting a line that had value of spectrum for different frequencies, you'd see a jagged line that jumped up and down, but generally went down. So the low frequency spectrum is more valuable than high frequency spectrum on a dollars per megahertz basis. But it's not always exactly true like that. And if you sort of sit there and say, whatever your forecast is for that, do I think that if I had active secondary markets, what would that new forecast line look like? And the answer is it would generally be below it, because of a bunch of different things that are happening. Technical innovation makes spectrum more substitutable. Regulatory reforms that are moving towards more market-based technologies, auctions, flexible licenses, new models like CBRS for sharing, and enabling more spectrum to reduce the amount, increasing the supply. All of those things are reducing scarcity, what ought to push down the opportunity cost for spectrum. And the opportunities for sharing are getting better because the technology is getting better. And then the localism also is going to push down the value of spectrum, because when you're trading spectrum over smaller areas and smaller time things, the value of that spectrum is less. And so if I'm only buying the spectrum where I need it, when I need it, I'm going to pay less than if I'm buying it, let's say, to cover the whole country, and I may not be using it everywhere. Okay. And competition also ought to tend to drive down the prices. But of course, the prices in a world of active spectrum are going to not be obviously uniform. There's a lot of interesting questions about what that lower curve is actually going to look like. Generally, it'll be lower, but there'll be some bands that might be actually more expensive or more valuable because they'll be more relatively scarce. You saw something like that happen in the markets for radio advertising. So generally, the internet's killed radio advertising, but drive time advertising is really valuable because that's a unique advertising property to address commuters that are focused in their cars and listening at a particular point in time. So you can get some different things like that. And it obviously depends on the licensing framework. So if you're buying spectrum that you have imperfect control over the interference environment, for example, it's not an exclusive license, but you have to share it, and you don't necessarily have total control over who you're sharing it with, you're likely to pay less for that spectrum. It's going to be less valuable a market price. Okay, so generically, if the markets work, we ought to expect them to push down. The hope is that they'll push down the opportunity cost for spectrum, making it less scarce. That also means that the gains from trade are less, and that the transaction cost sensitivity is greater, because if you go to a marketplace, you have to ask yourself, by buying this good or transferring this good, what I get for it, is it enough to cover the transaction costs I'm facing? Now, often that's when you move, the management of the market moves away from the real-time trading. So you do long-term kinds of contracts. Like, for example, I give you a permit to basically come into my unlicensed park anytime you want to. So next slide, please. Next, yeah, thanks. So you can talk about secondary markets in a lot of different ways, and I'm going to speed up here a little bit because I want to get through everything I want to cover. You can ask yourself about scarcity, coverage, duration, rights, contract, and there's other dimensions you could add here. And you can talk about what happens along those dimensions. Will there be secondary markets? Well, the answer is yes. I've said there kind of have to be. There's three kinds of efficiency we care about as economists. Productive efficiency, which is, are we producing resources at the lowest possible cost? If there's a way in which providers who aren't producing have a resource that is undervalued, that their use of it is less valuable than they could get by selling it to someone else, then that's going to give them a strong incentive to use that good efficiently, or to give it to someone else who's going to use it more efficiently. So productive efficiency, cost efficiency, all of that is improved if the spectrum can be transferred, the resource can be more fungibly transferred. Allocative efficiency is, getting it, if it is really scarce, that you figure out, okay, you both can't get it, so who gets it is the higher value. And dynamic efficiency is basically getting productive and allocative efficiency to be true over time, which means investment is happening in the right kinds of ways. There's not going to be any single market, secondary market. This makes sense because there's too many different kinds of spectrum bundles. There's already a ton of activity in secondary markets. Scott Walston earlier talked about this, and he wrote a very good paper back in 2010 with John Mayo that talked about the millions of megahertz that get transferred every year in market transactions in many different ways, merger and acquisition activity, spectrum leases, etc. There's even some real-time markets in certain bands, and there'll be more of that, and a lot of that makes sense. The question is real-time markets. What about real-time markets? Well, real-time markets, I think you can separate into two things. If you think about, like, for example, is a real-time market in selling movie tickets, okay? The movie theater sells the tickets, you buy the tickets, right? You can buy them in many different ways. That could be a real-time market. A secondary market in movie tickets, though, you wouldn't normally think of it that way. You'd think of maybe a secondary market as being like when you go and buy concert tickets that were already sold and are now being sold again by people. And both of those things have different economic roles. But when in the case of spectrum, the reason we call them secondary markets is because in most cases, the resource rights have been allocated to a particular user that now is going to basically try and redeploy them. And that's where the secondary thing happens. But anybody who owns spectrum can basically set up a real-time market. And there's a lot of technical questions about what they may or may not want to do there. And the leasing agreements and those sorts of things, or the opportunity to do those under flexible licenses created. So it's a question of, does it make business sense for them? And then the last point is this point about derivatives and things like forward contracts and future contracts and all of that. Those things will be important for risk management, and they certainly will evolve if we get active secondary markets for spectrum. Go to the next slide, please. So what are some of the requirements and challenges? And obviously, you got to have sellers and buyers. I think, a lot of the focus has been on sellers. Like, for example, why are people that currently have spectrum not making it available to everybody else? Well, they don't have the technologies to do that, possibly. The markets don't exist, but they also don't necessarily have the buyers. So we got to figure out who the buyers are. We also need rights bundles to transact. We have to figure out that those electro space things, or the virtualization of them, what are the right things to do? And on a local level, in a small place, it doesn't make sense to sort of be buying and selling spectrum for a few pennies. It's an interesting thought experiment, but I don't think it's terribly likely. However, doing that, in some sort of larger scale, or, more complex or nuanced sorts of roaming agreements, that's a much more interesting thing. But to do a lot of that kind of transactions, it's going to maybe look a lot more the way the complex transactions that exist in electric power agreements than exist in most commodity markets. And in electric power agreements, often what you're buying is rights that are tied to the underlying resource, which I think is also true. In terms of the contracts, we need the property rights to be tradable, and we'll need sort of the there'll be a bunch of challenges. Go to the last slide and let me stop and open this up to questions, because I see I'm almost out of time. So yes, absolutely, we need them to get dynamic efficiency. The challenge is, I think, and ought to be more a coexistence problem, because we hope that the prices are going to be really low, which means it'll be more about markets for matching than reallocation when we're talking about real-time markets. And the other stuff is more in nature of sort of the management of the licensing and all that sort of stuff. and that the markets can be implemented in lots and lots of ways. So I think the notion that they have to be done in a particular way, where a buyer says, I have the spectrum and I'm going to use that spectrum, this radio is going to use that spectrum right now and is negotiating that price, that is I think a naive and probably not a terribly helpful way to think about this. And that their key requirements are, we got to figure out how to get the property rights tradable, think about those. And they don't need to be exclusive, as I think we'll see sort of with the PAL stuff. Obviously, much more awareness about the RF and intelligence about what people are paying for it, how they value it, what the business models are all important things to make the ecosystem work. And then if the transactions that are conducted in the markets aren't enforceable. So for example, if spectrum's being traded on these real-time markets, but other people that aren't in those markets are having interference problems and destroying them, well, that's not going to work, because that's not what those contracts will be about. Okay, so
Bill, thank you so much. Yes,
right.
So yeah, sorry about that. So thank you so much. Really, really interesting presentation, and we've got lots of questions coming in. And luckily, I think we've got a networking break coming up next, so I think we can eat into that slightly to take some of these questions. If you're okay to stay with us for 5 minutes or so.
No, I'm absolutely. As an academic, and anybody has my email, you can contact me. My slides will be available. I apologize for it being a bit opaque.
No, you weren't. No, we were running late anyway, so no, it's no problem at all. So let's get straight into these questions. So first of all, we have a question that's come in from Dean Bubley. So thank you for the question, Dean. So Dean asks, what's the optimum geographic quantum for secondary spectrum licenses? How do we make it easier or regulated for localized spectrum to be obtained, for example, for enterprises?
Well, I would say first off that's something that obviously depends on band, it depends on business model. We have there's some places where people want national licenses and they have national license. So I think the question's most interesting when you ask what happens at the margin. And I think the example of that is for example, the small area licenses that have been licensed in Germany, or like the PAL licenses that have been made recently auctioned off in the CBRS. And I think the PAL licenses that were auctioned off in the CBRS, those were designed on larger territory sizes than a lot of the people had originally hoped they would be. Some people have said, oh, look how many licenses were auctioned. What are you doing? It's crazy. Well, the idea is that basically if the secondary markets, there ought to be some experimentation, and there certainly are applications where very small territories make a lot of sense. And if you have secondary markets, the size of the territories and the licenses doesn't matter ultimately. So if you have really little licenses, they can be aggregated up in a secondary market, or if you have really big licenses, they can be chopped down in a secondary market. The question is, if you have really big licenses, will they ever be sold and made available so they can be chopped down? Whereas if you have really little licenses, will the guys who want big licenses, are they in a better position to aggregate them? I would say that generally, if I had my choice between those two, it's easier for the big guys to aggregate the little licenses, but obviously that may pose some costs on them. So some more experimentation with small territory sizes is what we need.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. And another question that's come in. Question is, in order to enable secondary spectrum markets, is it necessary to effectively contrast or tackle hoarding behaviors by incumbent users? And has academia developed any models or approaches that could help regulators to tackle hoarding?
My own thing, yeah, there's lots of ways to deal with that. And one of the easiest ways to do that is the sort of, some policies is like use it or lose it. My view is that there's too much focus has been on the hoarding rules and too little on the secondary markets. If the secondary markets are working, hoarding doesn't make any sense, because basically, and if spectrum isn't scarce, then hoarding makes no sense. If the industry can stop the whole development of a trend, like the train starting, then a relatively low-cost intervention by a major player may make sense for them privately. But once the train gets out the door, it's very hard. So like, for example, in long-distance telephone service, which I spent some time in, I was at MCI back in the 80s. The biggest customers they had were the resellers. In this space, they'd be the MVNOs. And the MCI people who sold retail were like, for crying out loud, these guys are eating their lunch. Why are you selling to the wholesale guys? The reason was because they were saying that if MCI didn't sell to them, AT&T or Sprint or someone else would. So if there's enough capacity amongst the wholesale networks and the opportunities are there, their ability to foreclose will be very, very difficult. So that's sort of the simplest thing. But the other thing is you can measure, and I think another important way to measure, and the importance of having unlicensed spectrum near licensed spectrum in relatively adjacent bands, is it basically gives you a canary in the coal mine. If you find one band is ridiculously being used, but there's no equipment or cost reason why, and the other isn't, then that ought to suggest to you that you got a problem, and you ought to look at it more closely. And maybe it's a hoarding problem. I think those things have been way overstated, though.
Okay. Fantastic, thank you. So maybe just time for one final question, if we can. So we've got a question that's come in from Peter Zimri, who asks, will secondary markets naturally be derived from auction spectrum? And is there a need for price caps on spectrum trading?
I don't think there's first of all, in the near term, I don't think a need for price caps on spectrum trading makes any sense, because you're talking about a market that's going to evolve. It could very well be derived from auction spectrum, and you need to make sure, for example, that this wasn't some backdoor way to get collusion. So the design of the auction itself would anticipate what would happen. It may say there are certain kinds of strategies that are inconsistent with that. And I don't think there's anything natural about secondary markets necessarily evolving, and that we need to do a number of things. We need to see, for example, there's a lot of technical things about if you wanted to transfer spectrum, if you had a commodity of spectrum, you wanted to transfer it to another user locally on a very granular dynamic basis. There's lots of things about that make that difficult. And so like I've been thinking about that as sort of, if you think about the SaaS ecosystem and then saying, what would it look like to have a SaaS in your building that's part of your PBX that's jointly routing internet traffic and also dynamically spectrum, and using that in, let's say, an anchor tenant like a stadium or something like that. So you have a local SaaS manager. There's a huge amount of technical stuff that has nothing to do really with the secondary market. But if you had that, then you could do many more interesting secondary markets.
Brilliant. Bill, thank you so much. We could go on. There are more questions, but I'm afraid we really are out of time. So look, we really do appreciate you joining with us and giving us that very thought-provoking presentation in the way that things are supposed to be, thinking points we said.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And folks,
thank you.
I'm easy enough to find. If you have a question, send it to me.
There we are. I'm sure people can do that. So Bill, thank you so much again. Thank you. Fantastic, a great way to finish the sessions for the first part of the day. So we're now moving on to a networking break. So it's your opportunity to meet and to network over the next 15 minutes or so that we have now with other participants on the platform. So as those of you who are here on the first day will know, there's a networking area of the platform which you can find on the menu bar on the left-hand side. So please do make your way there now. I think we have around about over 300, just over 300 people on the platform at the moment. So lots of you to network and to meet with. So please do make your way over to that networking area. Click on the networking button and then click on ready, and you'll be matched to be able to connect with somebody else who's on the platform. So you have about 15 minutes or so to do that. And then we are back here at 20 minutes to the hour with our next session, which is going to be moving the focus from the low, which we looked at before, of course, to the mid-band spectrum. So lots of key bands in the mid-band frequencies, and we're going to be focusing on some of those coming up next. But once again, thank you to Bill. Thank you to our panelists this morning. Please do go and make use of the networking area of the platform, and we'll be back here in now around about 13 minutes. So we'll be back here very shortly. Thank you very much, everyone.